Wild weather across the United States has always been a defining feature of its vast geography, but in recent decades, the patterns have become increasingly tied to one of the most powerful climate drivers in the world, the El Niño Southern Oscillation, better known as ENSO. ENSO is not a storm itself, nor a single weather event. It is a recurring shift in the Pacific Ocean's climate system, toggling between the warming phase of El Niño, the cooling phase of La Niña, and the neutral conditions in between. Yet its fingerprints extend thousands of miles, shaping whether tornadoes rip across Oklahoma, whether drought-stricken California fields are left barren, or whether swollen rivers flood small towns in the Midwest. Understanding ENSO means understanding why farmers in Iowa track Pacific Ocean sea surface temperatures almost as closely as they track their own soil moisture. It also means understanding why the prices of beef, corn, soybeans, and wheat in American supermarkets can swing wildly depending on how this oscillation unfolds. ENSO is no longer just a scientific abstraction. It is a central player in America's weather, agriculture, and economy. The connection between ENSO and tornado outbreaks in the heart of the country has become one of the most closely studied relationships in climate science. Tornado Alley, stretching across Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and into Nebraska, has always been vulnerable to severe spring storms. But ENSO tilts the dice in favor of either more frequent outbreaks or relatively calm seasons. During La Niña years, the cooling of equatorial Pacific waters tends to strengthen the jet stream across the central United States, pulling in warm, moist Gulf air against dry continental air. This clash of air masses fuels supercells, the mother storms of tornadoes. Historical records reveal that some of the deadliest and most active tornado years have aligned with La Niña phases, including the notorious 2011 outbreak that devastated Joplin, Missouri, and killed more than 550 people across the country. By contrast, El Niño years often see the jet stream dip further south and disrupt storm development, muting tornado activity in the traditional alley, but sometimes shifting the risk to the southeast, where communities are less prepared and more vulnerable. This shifting geography of risk highlights why even city planners in places like Alabama or Mississippi are increasingly aware of ENSO's influence. The Midwest, America's breadbasket, tells another chapter of the ENSO story. When El Niño is strong, the subtropical jet stream pushes storms across California and into the Central Plains, often bringing wetter than normal winters and springs to the Midwest. On the surface, this might sound like good news for agriculture, more rainfall for corn and soybeans, but too much of a good thing quickly turns into disaster. In 1993, during one of the most infamous floods in U.S. history, swollen rivers devastated communities across Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri, submerging 20 million acres of farmland. Billions of dollars were lost, and it took years for some areas to fully recover. Scientists later linked that flood season to ENSO's heavy influence on storm tracks. Similarly, more recent El Niño years have contributed to persistent spring flooding, delaying planting schedules and reducing yields. Farmers who plant in April sometimes wait until June for their fields to dry enough for tractors, losing precious growing time. On the other hand, La Niña swings the pendulum in the opposite direction, often starving the Midwest of rainfall. Fields that should be green by July are instead marked by cracked soil and stunted stalks. For farmers, ENSO means volatility. One year too much rain, the next too little, and both extremes are financially punishing. Nowhere is ENSO's imprint more dramatic than in California, where the battle between floods and droughts defines the state's relationship with water. During El Niño years, Californians often brace for atmospheric rivers, plumes of tropical moisture that sweep across the Pacific and unleash torrents of rain and snow. These can replenish reservoirs and snowpacks in the Sierra Nevada, temporarily easing drought conditions. But they can also cause mudslides, swollen rivers, and deadly flash floods, as seen in the winter of 1997-1998, when El Niño storms caused over $550 million in damage and killed 17 people in California. La Niña, by contrast, is California's drought maker. Drier than average winters starve the state's reservoirs and leave millions dependent on shrinking groundwater. Wildfires thrive in these conditions, spreading faster and burning hotter across parched landscapes. The catastrophic fire seasons of recent years, including the 2017 and 2020 infernos that destroyed entire towns, have been linked in part to persistent La Niña conditions that exacerbated drought. For Californians, ENSO is a reminder that their climate is not just local but global, dictated as much by winds thousands of miles away as by anything happening in Sacramento or Los Angeles. For farmers in Iowa, ranchers in Texas, or vintners in California's Napa Valley, ENSO forecasts are not abstract reports. They are survival guides. The US Department of Agriculture and private forecasting firms issue seasonal climate outlooks tied to ENSO conditions, and these bulletins are pored over by those whose livelihoods hang on the weather. In Iowa, where corn yields can rise or fall by 20% depending on rainfall and temperature, knowing that an El Niño might bring wetter conditions can change planting strategies, fertilizer applications, and insurance purchases. In Texas, cattle ranchers face a different calculus. La Niña years often bring hotter, drier summers, stressing pastures and forcing ranchers to buy expensive feed or thin their herds early. The 2011 Texas drought, which coincided with a powerful La Niña, caused an estimated $7.6 billion in agricultural losses, much of it borne by cattle producers. Ranchers now watch ENSO bulletins as closely as they watch cattle prices. In California, vineyard owners adjust irrigation strategies based on ENSO projections, deciding whether to invest in costly water deliveries or risk parched vines. Across the agricultural heartland, these decisions ripple outward to affect the national economy. ENSO's role as a driver of US food prices and supply chains is less visible to the average grocery shopper, but it is undeniable. When drought slashes Midwest corn yields, prices spike on commodity markets, rippling through everything from animal feed costs to soda sweeteners. La Niña-induced droughts in South America compound the problem, tightening global supplies and driving prices higher still. Beef prices soar when Texas ranchers reduce their herds because pastures are barren. Milk and cheese prices follow as dairy operations feel the same feed cost pressures. Conversely, El Niño floods that damage crops can disrupt rail and river transport, delaying shipments and raising costs for processors and distributors. Food inflation, a term most consumers associate with government policy or corporate pricing, often has its roots in the Pacific Ocean's temperature swings. Supply chain managers for global food companies now include ENSO monitoring in their risk assessments. The oscillation's reach extends from Pacific waters to Midwestern farms to supermarket shelves in New York City. Even beyond food, ENSO reverberates through energy and infrastructure. Hydroelectric production in the Pacific Northwest, dependent on winter snowpacks, fluctuates with ENSO's wet and dry cycles. Natural gas demand spikes in La Niña winters when the northern US experiences colder than normal conditions, pushing up heating costs for millions of households. Transportation networks are also vulnerable. Floods tied to El Niño can shut down major barge routes along the Mississippi River, disrupting shipments of grain and coal. Meanwhile, drought-driven low river levels in La Niña years cause the opposite problem: too little water to float barges, forcing costly rail and truck alternatives. These disruptions underscore how a phenomenon that begins with Pacific trade winds can upend entire sectors of the American economy. The growing sophistication of ENSO forecasting has become one of the quiet revolutions of climate science. Decades ago, farmers and ranchers had little more than intuition and local almanacs to guide their decisions. Today, advanced models from NOAA's Climate Prediction Center and international agencies provide months of lead time. While forecasts are not perfect, they are good enough to guide insurance markets, planting decisions, and even government disaster planning. Some states have begun integrating ENSO probabilities into water management, stockpiling resources ahead of likely droughts or floods. Insurance companies, too, now use ENSO as part of their risk models, adjusting premiums for farmers and ranchers based on the expected conditions. What was once a niche scientific term has become an everyday factor in American economics. The intersection of ENSO, climate change, and human vulnerability makes the stakes even higher. A warming planet is altering the behavior of ENSO itself. possibly making El Niño and La Niña events more intense or frequent. This means that the wild swings already felt in Tornado Alley, the Midwest, and California could become even more dramatic. Communities are already grappling with compounding risks: a La Niña-driven drought layered on top of long-term climate drying, or an El Niño flood supercharged by warmer air holding more moisture. For policymakers, understanding ENSO is no longer optional. It is a necessity for planning resilient food systems, energy grids, and disaster responses. From the perspective of Crisis Lens, the story of ENSO and America's wild weather is not just about climate science. It is about the daily lives of millions. It is about the Iowa farmer who must decide whether to gamble on planting early or wait for drier fields. It is about the Texas rancher selling off part of her herd in a drought-stricken summer. It is about California families facing both flood insurance claims in one year and wildfire evacuations in the next. And it is about the grocery shopper in Chicago wondering why beef prices are higher this month than last. The hidden hand guiding all these experiences is ENSO, a phenomenon that begins thousands of miles away, but whose consequences are felt in every corner of the United States. The story of ENSO's reach across the United States becomes even clearer when we zoom in on how different regions prepare for and endure its swings. Tornado Alley is the most obvious starting point, a region where ENSO's invisible hand is often revealed in the number and intensity of tornadoes each spring. When the Pacific Ocean tilts into La Niña, the jet stream strengthens and runs right across the Great Plains. That ribbon of fast-moving air acts like an atmospheric highway, setting the stage for violent thunderstorms. Warm, humid air streaming up from the Gulf of Mexico collides with cooler, drier air spilling out of the Rockies, and the instability triggers rotating supercells. Research has shown that during La Niña years, not only does the frequency of tornadoes rise, but the outbreaks also tend to be larger, with more tornadoes forming within a single severe weather system. The infamous April 2011 super outbreak, which unleashed 360 tornadoes across 21 states in just 4 days, is a chilling reminder of how catastrophic La Niña-fueled springs can become. On the flip side, El Niño's altered jet stream tends to suppress this central corridor activity, but the storms do not vanish, they shift eastward. The southeast, often called Dixie Alley, becomes more vulnerable. And these tornadoes are especially dangerous because they frequently strike at night and in heavily forested terrain where warning visibility is low. The regional shift in tornado risk highlights why insurance firms, emergency managers, and even school systems track ENSO forecasts. It determines whether shelters in Oklahoma brace for a surge or whether communities in Alabama should prepare for an unusually active season. ENSO's mark is not confined to tornadoes. The flooding cycles of the Midwest serve as another testament to its far-reaching influence. In years when El Niño steers storm tracks across the heartland, rainfall totals rise significantly, saturating soils and pushing rivers to the brink. The planting season becomes a nightmare for farmers who watch fields sit underwater long past their optimal planting window. Corn and soybeans are particularly sensitive crops. They require precise timing, and delays cut into yields. During the Great Flood of 1993, the Mississippi and Missouri rivers swelled beyond recognition, inundating towns, shutting down bridges, and displacing thousands. Farmers bore the brunt of the losses, with drowned fields and destroyed infrastructure, leaving scars that lasted for years. When the pendulum swings to La Niña, the opposite danger emerges. Dry spells stretch on, rivers shrink, and irrigation pumps strain to meet the demand. In 2012, a La Niña-driven drought across the Midwest turned fields into dust bowls, reminiscent of the 1930s. Yields plummeted, grain prices surged, and livestock operations suffered as feed costs skyrocketed. These extreme wet-dry oscillations are now part of a cycle that farmers cannot ignore. Crop insurance claims balloon during ENSO years, and government relief packages become political flashpoints. For residents outside the Farm Belt, these shifts translate directly into the cost of bread, meat, and even ethanol-blended fuel at the pump. California, however, is where ENSO's fingerprints are perhaps most dramatically visible to the broader public. In El Niño winters, residents brace for heavy rains, swollen rivers, and landslides. The Sierra Nevada snowpack, which supplies a third of the state's water, often sees a dramatic boost. Hydropower facilities benefit, reservoirs refill, and for a fleeting moment, the fear of drought eases. But the deluge comes with a price. Roads collapse under mudslides, coastal towns deal with flooding, and emergency services are stretched thin. In contrast, La Niña years bring punishing dryness. Reservoirs dip to record lows, fields lie fallow, and water rationing becomes a political battlefield. Drought-stressed forests turn into tinder boxes, and one spark can ignite wildfires that consume entire communities, as happened in Paradise in 2018. Californians know that ENSO is not just a seasonal curiosity. It is the driver behind some of their most destructive natural disasters. State planners integrate ENSO outlooks into water allocations, firefighting strategies, and even public health planning, knowing that both extremes carry profound risks. On the ground, the people most attuned to ENSO's rhythm are the farmers, ranchers, and small-town communities whose survival depends on anticipating its mood swings. Iowa farmers scrutinize seasonal forecasts from the Climate Prediction Center, weighing whether an El Niño year's expected rains will improve yields or whether too much moisture will waterlog fields. The difference is often razor-thin, and wrong decisions can sink a farm's finances. In Texas, ranchers fear La Niña summers that parch grazing lands. When pastures wither, cattle are sold early, glutting the market in the short term, but driving beef prices higher months later when supplies run tight. The ranching industry is painfully aware of how ENSO's cycles echo in market prices and consumer behavior. Even fisheries along the Gulf Coast and West Coast watch ENSO closely, as shifts in water temperature and ocean currents affect fish populations, disrupting both local economies and national seafood supply chains. These interlocking effects make ENSO as much an economic driver as a climate one. The grocery store is where the average American feels these invisible waves. When ENSO upends weather across the Farm Belt, it reshapes the price tags on supermarket shelves. Drought-stricken corn leads to higher feed prices, which push up costs for beef, pork, and poultry. Floods that delay harvests tighten supplies, spiking flour and soybean oil prices. Dairy is squeezed on both ends. Feed costs rise, and water shortages stress cattle. The ripple effect extends to processed foods, snacks, and even soda. For low-income households, where food takes up a larger share of budgets, ENSO's fluctuations are not academic. They are a monthly struggle. Economists now track ENSO alongside interest rates and oil prices as a key factor in inflationary pressures. What happens in the equatorial Pacific may well determine whether grocery bills climb by 5 or 15% in a given year. Energy markets, too, bend under ENSO's influence. La Niña winters often deliver frigid air across the northern United States, boosting demand for natural gas and heating oil. Prices climb as utilities scramble to meet consumption spikes. El Niño winters, by contrast, tend to be milder, softening heating demand, but often driving wetter, stormier conditions that test power grids and flood infrastructure. Hydropower production in the northwest, which relies on snowmelt, swings dramatically with ENSO's snowpack cycles. Low water years cut into energy supplies, forcing greater reliance on fossil fuels. For policymakers, energy planners, and investors, tracking ENSO has become a necessity in anticipating demand and stabilizing markets. Perhaps most striking is how a climate oscillation thousands of miles away in the Pacific has become embedded in America's risk management systems. Insurance companies adjust premiums for farms, ranches, and even coastal properties based on ENSO outlooks. Commodity traders hedge bets on grain futures depending on whether El Niño or La Niña is expected. Emergency managers pre-position resources for floods or droughts months in advance, guided by ENSO forecasts. The ripple effects cascade through layers of the economy, shaping decisions that range from local crop planting schedules to global food security strategies. And with climate change amplifying extremes, ENSO's swings are becoming sharper and more consequential. Whether it is tornadoes tearing across Oklahoma, floods swallowing Iowa fields, or fires raging in California, ENSO remains the unseen architect of America's most volatile weather. ENSO's influence across the United States is not just a matter of meteorology. It is a matter of livelihoods, markets, and long-term resilience. Each phase of this oscillation sets in motion a chain of cause and effect that stretches from the Pacific Ocean to the dinner plates of American households. In Tornado Alley, La Niña's chilling presence is often most feared. As the Pacific waters cool, the jet stream strengthens and migrates into the Central Plains, amplifying the potential for violent spring weather. For towns across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, this means the risk of entire neighborhoods being shredded in the span of a few minutes. Residents learn to live with this uncertainty, but ENSO intensifies it. The outbreaks in La Niña years tend to be more widespread, often spawning multiple long-track tornadoes within the same system. Survivors from the 2011 Joplin disaster recall how quickly the sky darkened and how little time there was to react. Meteorologists, too, acknowledge the difficulty. ENSO does not dictate the exact date or place of a tornado, but it shapes the background conditions in which tornadoes are more likely to form. The difference between a season with a few dozen tornadoes and one with hundreds often traces back to the Pacific Ocean's subtle shifts. For families rebuilding homes, the science may feel abstract, but the consequences are painfully real. In the Midwest, farmers are on the front lines of ENSO's volatility. Flood years test every piece of infrastructure, from levees to grain elevators. When El Niño storms march across the region, they saturate soils, delay planting, and in some cases drown crops before they sprout. The 2019 floods, for example, swamped millions of acres, preventing farmers from planting altogether. Those who had invested heavily in seed and fertilizer lost not only the season's income, but also their credit stability for years to come. At the other extreme, La Niña droughts cut yields so drastically that grain markets spike, reverberating globally. For small-town communities dependent on agriculture, the difference between El Niño and La Niña is the difference between a bustling main street and boarded-up storefronts. Each year, town halls fill with anxious discussions about how to interpret seasonal forecasts. Cooperative extension agents distribute ENSO updates, explaining in plain language what a strong El Niño or a moderate La Niña might mean for planting, harvesting, and insurance claims. These meetings underscore how deeply ENSO has entered the vocabulary of rural America. It is no longer a foreign climate term, it is part of the rhythm of life. California, meanwhile, lives on a knife's edge between water scarcity and flooding, and ENSO tips that balance. When El Niño lines up just right, it can drench the state with rain and replenish critical reservoirs. Ski resorts in the Sierra Nevada celebrate bumper snow years, and water managers breathe a sigh of relief. But the same storms trigger landslides that bury highways and neighborhoods, while flood-prone regions brace for disaster. In La Niña years, the opposite occurs. The skies close up, reservoirs shrink, and millions of acres of farmland are left dry. Almond orchards, which require steady irrigation, are sometimes bulldozed when water rights dry up. The wine industry, reliant on delicate balances of rain and sun, recalibrates year by year based on ENSO's mood. And when the forests dry, wildfires erupt with terrifying speed. Entire communities from Paradise to Santa Rosa have been reduced to ash in seasons linked to La Niña-induced drought. For Californians, ENSO is a cycle of whiplash, pushing the state from one crisis to another with little time to recover. The impact of ENSO does not stop at the farm gate or state line. It extends into the arteries of the US economy. Food supply chains, already fragile in an era of globalization, are highly sensitive to ENSO disruptions. A La Niña drought in the Midwest not only reduces corn yields, but also chokes river transport when water levels drop. Barges that normally carry millions of tons of grain down the Mississippi are stranded or forced to carry lighter loads, driving up costs. Rail networks and trucking fleets absorb the overflow, but at higher expense. Meanwhile, floods during El Niño years close the same routes for opposite reasons: too much water, damaged levees, and impassable bridges. Either way, ENSO adds volatility to transportation costs that ripple into consumer prices. Multinational food companies that operate processing plants in the Midwest are forced to juggle shipments, reroute supplies, and sometimes import raw materials from abroad. This reshuffling can affect everything from bread to biofuels, reminding consumers that ENSO is hidden behind every grocery aisle. Energy systems are equally exposed. In the Pacific Northwest, snowmelt is the lifeblood of hydroelectric dams. During El Niño winters, heavy snows bolster reservoirs, feeding turbines and keeping electricity costs low. But La Niña drought years bring the opposite problem. Low snowpack means empty reservoirs, reduced hydroelectric output, and greater reliance on natural gas and coal. This switch not only raises costs for households, but also increases carbon emissions, undermining climate goals. Across the northern US, La Niña's tendency to deliver bitterly cold winters strains natural gas supplies, sending heating bills skyrocketing. Consumers often have no idea that their monthly bill is being shaped by ocean currents thousands of miles away. In El Niño winters, the opposite happens. Milder conditions reduce demand, stabilizing prices, but heavy storms stress grids and expose weaknesses in infrastructure. For utilities, ENSO has become a critical planning variable, shaping decisions about energy reserves, grid maintenance, and investment in renewable resources. Ranchers in Texas and Oklahoma offer another perspective. ENSO shapes not just weather, but the very composition of herds and the timing of sales. In La Niña summers, when pastures dry out, ranchers face agonizing choices: spend heavily on supplemental feed or cull their herds early to avoid losses. Either choice has ripple effects. Selling early floods the market, driving down short-term prices, but the reduced herd size leads to higher beef prices months later when supply tightens. Consumers in cities thousands of miles away feel the consequences as steaks and hamburgers become more expensive. Dairy farmers, too, are caught in this cycle, with milk and cheese prices rising and falling based on feed and water availability. ENSO, in this way, becomes a hidden actor in the nation's dinner table economy, dictating choices that no individual rancher or farmer can control. The broader lesson is that ENSO is not a distant scientific curiosity, but a lived reality across America. It is embedded in the choices of farmers who watch the sky, the calculations of traders on Wall Street, and the concerns of families at the grocery checkout. Each oscillation reshuffles winners and losers. Some crops thrive, others fail. Some energy markets stabilize, others surge. Some communities escape flooding, others are submerged. In every case, the stakes are rising as climate change adds fuel to ENSO's fire, sharpening its impacts and stretching recovery times. For a country as vast and diverse as the United States, ENSO is the common thread running through tornado sirens in Oklahoma, flood warnings in Iowa, and wildfire evacuations in California. To ignore it is to ignore the heartbeat of America's most volatile weather and the economic tremors it sets off. Across Tornado Alley, the Midwest and California, the evidence is undeniable. ENSO is not just an oceanic cycle, but a force that shapes the daily lives of millions of Americans. From tornado outbreaks fueled by La Niña, to El Niño floods drowning farms, to wildfires raging in drought-stricken California, its reach is vast and relentless. Farmers track it to protect their harvests, ranchers watch it to safeguard their herds, and families unknowingly feel its impact every time food prices rise or energy bills spike. ENSO is the invisible architect of both abundance and scarcity, stability and disruption. As climate change intensifies these swings, understanding ENSO has never been more urgent. It is not only about predicting weather, but about preparing for the economic, social, and environmental consequences that follow. The United States cannot afford to treat it as background noise. It must be part of how we plan, farm, build, and adapt. If you want to stay informed about how global forces like ENSO shape America's future, from weather disasters to the economy you depend on, make sure to subscribe to Crisis Lens. Join us as we uncover the hidden patterns driving tomorrow's challenges and how we can face them together.